I have been married to Corbin Ashford twice, and the first time his mother took my father's farm while I was in a hospital bed. This time I woke 9 days before the wedding, and I let the wedding happen anyway. I came back on a Tuesday in the tack room, standing up, with a bridle over my shoulder and the smell of neat's foot oil in my nose, and the clock on the wall saying 6:20, and it took me about 4 seconds to understand what the clock meant, because that clock stopped in the November after the wedding, and nobody ever fixed it, and it was running. I put the bridle on the hook. I went out into the aisle and counted stalls, and Ardith was in the 4th one, alive, gray, 11 years old instead of dead, with her head over the door doing the thing she does with her lip, and I stood in front of that mare and held on to the door for a while. Then I went to the office and looked at a calendar. The 9th of April, 9 days. I want to tell you exactly what 9 days meant, because everything I did afterward comes out of that number. On the 18th of April, I married Corbin Ashford in the garden at Ellendale in front of 110 people. On the 2nd of June, Louisa Ashford's council exercised a clause in a cross-collateralized loan that my father had signed in 2019 on the grounds that the marriage constituted a change in farm management and called $2.1 million. On the 9th of September, I went down in the breeding shed at Ashford under a 2-year-old that should never have been in there and broke my pelvis in 2 places, and on the 4th of December, 11 weeks later, I died of sepsis in a hospital in Lexington at 32 years old. And the last document I ever read was a sale notice for Ellendale Farm, 640 acres, established 1931, on a phone that a nurse held for me because I could not hold it. So I stood in the office at 6:20 on the 9th of April with a working clock and a live horse, and I did not cry, and I did not go and find Corbin, and I did not drive to a lawyer. I sat down at my father's desk, and I wrote a list of every date I could remember, and it took me 2 hours, and I still have it, and the handwriting on it is very bad because my hands were not steady. And then I did the arithmetic that everybody who hears this story argues with me about, and I would like to get ahead of them. I could not refuse the wedding. Refusing the wedding does not save Ellendale. It kills it 11 days sooner. Ellendale had 11 days. That is not a figure of speech. On the 20th of April, the note came due, and my father was 3 years dead, and the farm carried $2.1 million of debt against 640 acres, 41 horses, and a broodmare band that had not produced a stakes winner since 2016. The Ashford marriage was not romance, and nobody in either family ever pretended it was. Louisa Ashford came to my father's funeral in 2021, and 11 months later she came to my kitchen with a proposal that she described accurately as a merger, and the terms were that Ashford Bloodstock would assume the note, that Ellendale would stand as a satellite operation under the Ashford banner, and that I would marry her elder son. And I said yes at 29 years old in my own kitchen with a folder in front of me, and I want to be honest that I was not coerced with a gun. I was coerced with a spreadsheet, which works better and leaves no marks. So on the 9th of April, in a second life, with 9 days, I ran the same numbers and got the same answer. And the answer was that a woman who refuses that marriage is a woman standing in a field on the 21st of April watching a receiver's truck come up the drive, and that a woman who accepts it has a name on a deed, a seat at a table, and, most importantly, a key. Because here is the thing that had never once occurred to me in the entire first version of my life. A wife can walk in. Nobody at Ashford Bloodstock ever stopped me anywhere. Not once, not in the whole 8 months I was married to that man, and it never crossed my mind to use it because I was busy being appropriate. There is a version of me who is very angry with that girl, and I have had to put her away because she was 30 and frightened and had just buried her father, and she did the best she could with a spreadsheet. My father was not a good businessman, and he was a great horseman, and in this business those two facts get you exactly where they got him. Emmett Vance could look at a yearling for 11 seconds and tell you what it would be at 4, and he was right often enough that men who did not like him drove 2 hours to stand next to him at a sale and watch where his eyes went. He also gave a mare away in 2013 because he liked the girl who came to look at her, and he carried a groom named Wallace on full pay for 2 years after Wallace could not work anymore, and he never once in his life read a loan document past the first page, and he told me that himself, proudly, as though it were a personality. He taught me to hold a foal by the tail and the neck, and never the legs. He made me muck out every stall in that barn on the morning after my mother's funeral, because he said the horses did not know, and I hated him for 11 years about that, and then understood it in about 4 seconds at 31, in a barn on a Tuesday. And in the last year, when he knew what the note was, he stopped coming down to the barn before 8, which for a man who had been in that aisle at 5:30 for 30 years was the loudest thing he ever did. I did not ask him about it. That is my inheritance, and I have made my peace with it. Nobody in my family has ever once asked anybody a direct question, and it cost us 640 acres in my life. Corbin, for the record, is not warm. He is not cruel either, which people find less satisfying. He is a man who was raised to run an operation and who treats every conversation as an item. And in 8 months of marriage, he never once raised his voice to me and never once asked me a question that was not logistical. And on the day I broke my pelvis, he sat in that hospital for 9 hours and then took a call in the corridor and did not come back in. That is the whole man. I married him again on the 18th of April, in the same garden, in the same dress, in front of most of the same 110 people, and my aunt cried in the same place, and I stood up there and said the same words and thought about a clock. And when he kissed me, I thought, you are going to be the least interesting problem I solve this year, and I was right. And that turned out to be the saddest thing about him. The stallion's name was Bellwether. Everything at Ashford, the whole operation, 400 acres, the training barn, the insurance, Louisa's standing on 3 boards, sits on top of one gray horse who won a grade 1 at 4, and who has stood at that farm since 2020 at $40,000 a season. And what I knew, because I had lived through it once, is that on the 11th of November, the reproductive specialists at Rood and Riddle would report that Bellwether had a total sperm count consistent with an acquired testicular degeneration that had been developing for at least 2 seasons, that his per-cycle conception rate for the previous spring would come back at 11% against a book of 140 mares, and that the horse was, in the language of the trade, finished. In the first life that news broke on the 12th of November, and Ashford Bloodstock survived it, because Louisa had spent 18 months quietly preparing for it, and because a stallion going infertile is a misfortune and not a crime. Nobody went to prison. Ashford took a bad year and sold 2 farms and kept everything. What I understood, sitting at my father's desk on the 9th of April with a list in bad handwriting, is that the difference between a misfortune and a crime is entirely a question of what somebody knew and when. And I knew something that nobody was supposed to know for 7 months, which is that this horse had been going for 2 seasons, which meant that the spring of the previous year was already bad, which meant that somewhere in that farm there was a piece of paper from a year ago with a number on it. So I did not tell anybody about November. I have been asked, by the only 3 people who know all of this, why I did not simply say, in April, that the stallion was finished and get out in front of it, and the answer is that I would have been a 29-year-old bride with a story about the future, and by the end of that week, Louisa Ashford would have had me assessed by a physician she chose. And I know that because it is exactly what she did to my father's sister in 2014. Nobody believes the woman who knows the future. They believe the woman with the file. So I spent 7 months building a file in an office nobody stopped me walking into as a wife in cardigans, being appropriate. I copied the breeding shed records for 2 seasons, which are handwritten in a book by whoever is on that night. I copied the return sheets. I copied the contracts. And this is where it turned, because a stallion season contract normally carries a live full guarantee. And starting in the January before, 41 of Bellwether's contracts had been written on a no-guarantee basis at a discounted fee, offered to smaller breeders who could not have afforded him otherwise, and marketed by Peyton Ashford personally as a favor to the little guy. 41 people had been sold at a discount. A season on a stallion the farm already knew was failing on terms that meant they got nothing if there was no foal. That is not a misfortune, that is a business model. The September sale runs 4 days, and it is where I made my one real mistake. Keeneland in September is 1,400 yearlings and everybody in the industry in one place, and Ashford consigned 9 head, and I was there in the barn area doing what a wife does, which is being pleasant near the coffee. And Peyton Ashford, who is 33, and who drinks at sales the way other men breathe, came down the Shedrow at 11 at night and found me with a folder. I had been photographing return sheets in the consignment office. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Paperwork." He said, "In September?" And then he took the folder off me, physically, out of my hands, and I let him, because the alternative was a fight in a barn aisle at Keeneland, and he flipped through it and did not understand a single page of it, which is the only reason I am able to tell you this. He said, "This is shed stuff." I said it was. He said, "Why have you got shed stuff?" And then, because Peyton is the loud one, and the loud ones always tell you what they are frightened of, he said, "Does Mother know you're in the office?" That was the mistake, and I paid for it 11 days later, when the office locks were changed and I was given a very warm explanation about insurance. What I had by then, thank God, was everything except the veterinary records. I got the office back, incidentally, 11 days after they changed the locks, and I want to put the method here because it is the least glamorous thing in this story, and it worked. I did not argue about the locks. I wrote to the farm's insurer as a named insured on the operations policy, requesting the schedule of covered bloodstock and the fertility endorsements, which a named insured is entitled to ask for, and which does not go through the farm office at all. It took 9 days, and it came to my house in an envelope, and it contained the fertility endorsement on Bellwether, and the endorsement had been amended in the previous February, and the amendment reduced the coverage. Somebody had told an insurance company something in February that nobody had told 41 breeders in March. Louisa Ashford had spent 11 years making sure nothing went out in writing over her name, and she had not thought about the insurer because nobody thinks about the insurer. And that brings me to Simone Federley, who was Corbin's before I was, who was the farm's reproductive vet, who was genuinely excellent at her job, and who cried at my wedding in a way that everybody found touching. Simone came to Ellendale in October, alone, in the evening, and stood in my kitchen and said she needed to say something and could not say it. She said it 3 times. She said, "I don't want to cause trouble. I've never wanted to cause trouble." And she said, "Corbin doesn't know anything, whatever else he doesn't know." And then she said, "I need you to understand what it's like to be the only person in a building who isn't a member of the family. And I want to be very clear about what I did next because it is the coldest thing I have ever done and I would do it again." I did not comfort her. I let the silence run. I let a woman stand in my kitchen with her hands shaking for what was probably 40 seconds, and then I said, "Simone, when did you first put a number on that horse in writing?" And she looked at the floor and said, "March of last year, 19 months. 19 months before the sale that was coming in November, a licensed veterinarian had written a number down, and 41 people had been sold a discounted season after that, and Simone Federley went home that night, and I did not sleep at all. Louisa Ashford does not sign things. I need to explain this properly, because it is the whole architecture of the woman, and it is why she nearly walked away from all of it. In 11 years of documents at that farm, across 2 lifetimes and about 2,000 pages, Louisa Ashford's signature appears on a total of 9. All of them bank instruments where a signature is unavoidable. Everything else goes out over Corbin's name or Peyton's name or the office manager's. She does not write emails. She telephones. She has a standing weekly meeting with each department head, alone, no minutes. In the first version of my life, I thought she was old-fashioned. She is not old-fashioned. She is careful, and there is a difference, and the difference is 19 months of a stallion's failing numbers, traveling through an organization entirely by voice. She came to see me in October, 2 days after Simone, which I do not think was a coincidence, and she sat in my father's kitchen, and she was, I have to say, magnificent. She said, "You've been in the office." I said I had. She said I'd have done the same, and then she said the thing that was designed to end it, and it very nearly did, because it was true. She said, "Your father knew, Thea," she said. "In 2019, when he signed that note, he sat where you're sitting and he asked me for a cross-collateral because he could not get money anywhere else, and I gave it to him and he thanked me. Everything that has happened to this farm since is the interest on a favor he asked for. You've been walking around my office for 6 months looking for a villain, and the first name in the file is Emmett Vance, and I did not have anything. I sat in my father's kitchen, in the chair he died about 11 feet from, and I had nothing at all, because it was true. He had signed it. He had asked her for it, and I had spent 2 lifetimes making him a better man than the paperwork does. So I said the only thing I had, which was, "Did he know about the horse?" And she said, "Don't be stupid." And I said, "Then it isn't the same file." And Louisa Ashford, who has never in her life been rude to anybody, stood up and put her cup in my sink and said, "You've got 9 days to be a wife again or you've got a receiver," which was a date, and which was a threat, and which was also, and she did not notice this, the first thing she had ever said to me that I could have written down and used, and which I did write down in the car that night. The November sale is held under lights. The breeding stock sale is a different animal from September. It is quieter and richer, and it is where an operation's whole book gets valued in public over 4 evenings, and Ashford was consigning 11 mares and, on the second evening, offering shares in the stallion. That is the detail that made it possible. Louisa had scheduled, for the evening of the 10th of November, a public offering of 4 shares in Bellwether at $400,000 each, 1 day before the reproductive report was due back, and I sat in the pavilion at Ellendale's own consignment on the 9th, and understood that I had been handed the room. So on the 10th of November I went to the sales office at 4 in the afternoon, and I bought a bidder's card as Thea Vance, which is my own name, which is on the farm I own, and which nobody had thought about. And at 8:40 in the evening, when the offering came into the ring, I stood up in the seats with a folder. I did it in order. First the shed book, 2 seasons, photographed pages, in the hand of the man who was on that night, with the covers and the returns. Then the per cycle conception rates I had built off those sheets myself, which is arithmetic anybody in that room could do, and most of them could do faster than me. 61% 2 springs ago, 34% last spring, on a horse advertised at 90. Somebody in the 3rd row said, 34, out loud, and that was the first crack. The auctioneer stopped, which they never do. Then the 41 no-guarantee contracts, all dated after January, all at a discounted fee, and I read out 4 of the names of the breeders, small people, 2 of them in that room, and one of them, a woman from Ocala who stands 2 horses, said, "That's mine," in a voice that carried all the way up. A consignor 2 rows down said, "Where'd you get shed sheets?" And I said, out of the shed, in March, as the wife of the managing partner, with a farm key I was given at my wedding, and that if anybody in that pavilion wanted to argue that a wife walking into her husband's breeding shed is theft, I would be delighted to have that argument in front of the trade press, and I gestured at the trade press, who were already standing up. Then Louisa's counsel was on his feet, saying this was a sales pavilion and not a forum, and Peyton was shouting from the consignor's box, and I said, into all of it, the sentence I had written in the car in October. I said, "Mrs. Ashford told me in my own kitchen that I had 9 days to be a wife or a receiver. She has never once written that down. She has never written any of this down. That is not carefulness. That is a method, and every single one of you has been doing business with it for 11 years. And then Simone Federley stood up in the back, in a barn coat, and said, "I did the evaluations." The auctioneer said, "Ma'am," she said, "I'm the reproductive vet at Ashford Bloodstock, and I did the evaluations. And the first one that concerned me is dated the 11th of March last year, and it went to Mrs. Ashford by telephone, because everything goes to Mrs. Ashford by telephone, and I was told the number was preliminary, and I have signed 11 more since. Thank you for listening to Channel Crystal Novel." And Corbin Ashford, who had been standing at the rail through all of it, with his hands in his pockets, doing absolutely nothing, walked up to the auctioneer's stand, took the microphone and said, "The shares are withdrawn," which is the single decent act of either of his lifetimes, and which cost him about $2 million, and which he did without looking at his mother. The Jockey Club opened its file in February, and the federal grand jury sat in the summer, and Louisa Ashford was indicted on 11 counts of wire fraud in the autumn, on the theory that the discounted no-guarantee contracts were sold by telephone and email across state lines, with knowledge of the stallion's condition, which is exactly the kind of charge her whole method was designed to avoid, and exactly the kind she could not avoid once 41 buyers all told the same story. She is 67. She took it to trial, which surprised nobody who has met her, and was convicted on 9 of 11 and is serving 51 months, and her counsel has an appeal in on the knowledge element that everybody says is not frivolous. Peyton was arrested at the sale itself on the night for what he did to a security officer in the consignor's box, and the assault plea came first, and the fraud plea came 14 months later, and he did 9 months and is now selling farm equipment in Tennessee, and is, by every account I have had, better. Simone Federley surrendered her license voluntarily before the board could act, testified for 3 days, and was permitted to reapply after 2 years, and did, and practices in Virginia, and we exchange a card at Christmas and have never once spoken on the telephone. The 41 breeders received restitution in the spring, which took 4 years and came to about 60%, and the woman from Ocala sent me a photograph of a filly she bred out of the settlement, and I have it on the refrigerator. The sales company changed its conditions of sale the following year to require disclosure of any veterinary finding materially affecting a stallion's fertility within the preceding 24 months, which is 1 paragraph, and which the trade press called the Bellwether clause for about 6 weeks, until everybody got bored, and it just became the rule. 2 other farms quietly retired stallions that winter, rather than stand them another season, and I have never been told, and will never be told, whether that was conscience or counsel. The insurer that wrote Ashford's mortality and fertility cover denied the claim and sued to rescind 3 prior policy years, and that case ran for 4 years, and I gave a deposition in it that lasted 9 hours and cost me a week of sleep. Ashford Bloodstock was sold in pieces. The training barn went to a syndicate. The 400 acres went to a family from Louisville who are, by all accounts, decent, and the name came off the gate in April. Corbin did not go to prison because there was nothing to charge him with, which is its own kind of verdict on a man. He handed over the stallion book without being subpoenaed for it, in a banker's box, in person at Ellendale in the rain, and he stood in the drive and said, "I should have asked what you were doing in the office." I said, "You should have asked what anybody was doing anywhere." He said, "I know." Then he said, "Are we finished?" And I said, "Yes," and the divorce was uncontested, and I kept Ellendale and he kept the horses that were not part of the estate, and I have seen him twice since, at sales, and we are civil. And Bellwether, that is the part nobody expects to be the hard part. He was 12 years old and infertile and worth nothing at all, and a horse like that goes one of about 3 ways, and 2 of them are bad, and I bought him at the dispersal in March for $1,100, which was the last money I had that year, and Mickey the farrier still brings it up. He is 19 now. He is out in the front field at Ellendale with Ardith, who is 19 as well, and who does not like him, and has never liked him, and they stand about 40 feet apart all day, every day, in the manner of 2 people in a long marriage. He is the reason people slow down on the road. Twice a year somebody pulls into the drive and asks whether that is him, and I say yes, and they get out and look at him over the fence for a while, and about half of them tell me a story about a mare they sent him and what she produced, and the other half do not say anything at all, and I have learned not to ask which half a person is going to be. I did not save that horse to be gracious. I want to be exact, because I have heard the gracious version told back to me at a party, and it made me want to put my drink down and leave. I bought him because he is the only living witness to 19 months of telephone calls, and because for 2 seasons this entire industry looked at a gray horse and saw a number, and I wanted the number to be $1,100, and I wanted it to be mine. The clock in the tack room still says 6:20. It stopped again in the November after, the same November, on the same day, which I have never told anybody, and which I think about more than I should, and I have not fixed it, and I am not going to. So here is what I want to know from you, because you have been standing in that pavilion with me the whole time. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next